You're listening to an Ono Media podcast.
Good morning, and thanks for joining me for Rise in Crime, your morning caffeine hit all about crime. I'm Mama Jules, and I'm bringing you an update to a case that deeply divided Duke University in 2006. It was divided by racial lines, but also divided by economic lines, and all of that was mixed in with media bias and, eventually, prosecutorial misconduct. At the center of this story in 2006, 28-year-old Crystal Mangum. She's a stripper, a part-time stripper, with a difficult past, and the story also includes 3 Duke lacrosse players. But let's start with Crystal. Crystal was born into humble means, with a father who worked as a truck driver and a mother who stayed home with her and her 2 siblings. When Crystal was 14 years old, she accused 3 men of kidnapping and raping her. One of the men was her current boyfriend, who was 21 years old at the time. Yeah, Crystal's 14 and he's 21. Now, the charges, they didn't really stick, and Crystal backed away from the claim. And her family, well, they were torn about the claims. Some relatives were saying she didn't actually force the rape and kidnapping claims because the young girl was just scared for her life. But her mother said she believed the claims, but then her father said he didn't believe the events that Crystal had reported. And it seems this whole time for Crystal, ages 14 to 17, were just full of tumult. She graduated from Hillside High School in North Carolina, and then she joined the U.S. Navy, where she was trained to operate radios and navigational technology. During her service, really early on actually, Crystal married a man named Kenneth, but that whole relationship also had difficulties. Shortly after tying the knot, Crystal reported that Kenneth had tried to kill her, but the charges didn't go forward because Crystal didn't show up to the court hearing. Then, after 2 years of naval service, Crystal was dismissed due to her pregnancy by a fellow service member, so not her husband. By 2002, Crystal had another child, and she was working as an exotic dancer to make ends meet. During this time, Crystal had a brush with the law. She had allegedly given a lap dance to a man who owned a taxi cab. Crystal stole that customer's cab, and police pursued her at high speeds, reaching 70 miles per hour. When the pursuit ended, Crystal had almost run over a police officer, and she was also driving the stolen cab with a blood alcohol content over twice the legal limit. When all was said and done, Crystal pled guilty to 4 charges. She spent 3 weekends in jail, and she paid $4,200 in restitution. And I feel like I'm really only bringing up all of the bad parts of Crystal's life, but there was good. In 2004, she earned her associate degree from a community college, and she then enrolled full-time at North Carolina Central University. And her grades were pretty decent too. She was carrying a 3.0 GPA, and she was working towards a degree in police psychology. It was in March of 2006 when Crystal's progress broke down completely. She had been hired by members of the Duke lacrosse team to perform or strip at a party hosted by the 2 team captains at their Durham residence. And it's important to note, this house, it was owned by Duke University. The team captains were given the luxury of living in the housing. Now, the party was organized because the team couldn't leave campus during spring break. Their competition schedule meant the young men would remain in Durham, so the captains put together an alcohol-fueled mini spring break celebration. When players arrived, some didn't know that they would be required to contribute money to the entertainment fund. And that entertainment was made available by Allure. Okay, that's an escort service that one of the team captains had contacted. When he scheduled the entertainment, he asked for 2 white strippers. Allure, however, sent Crystal, who is biracial. She has half black, half white as her heritage. And then there was another stripper named Kim, who was half black, half Asian. Crystal had already consumed alcohol and a muscle relaxer before she showed up at the lacrosse party event. And Kim drove herself to the party, but Crystal was dropped off. So we have alcohol and we have young men who are, I'm going to kind of say this friendly, blowing off some steam. And we have Crystal already in a compromised physical state. One of the captains later told authorities that one of the athletes asked the two women if they had any sex toys. Kim responded by asking that athlete if his equipment was too small for satisfaction. Well, possibly embarrassed, the athlete grabbed a broomstick and suggested to Kim that he use that as a toy. Okay, clearly this environment has escalated to a level that the women felt unsafe. Crystal and Kim stopped the performance and locked themselves in the bathroom. While the women were locked in the bathroom, two players left the home, Reed Seligman and Colin Finnerty. Well, eventually, Crystal and Kim came out of the bathroom. But remember, Crystal doesn't have a car, and she's a bit inebriated. Crystal wandered through the small yard, and Kim talked with a couple of the players. According to reports, the players were trying to get the women to come back in the house and complete the entertainment portion of the party. Some of the young men who had contributed to the entertainment budget, well, they were expecting more for the amount that they had paid, so there was some pressure being put on these women. Varying reports say that the women eventually re-entered the small home, but that Crystal was triggered when she saw the athlete who had made the broomstick comment, and she retreated to the bathroom again. The scene is now kind of in chaos, and the captains and a couple of the players who lived at the house, well, they asked everyone to just leave, including Crystal and Kim. This party was over. When everyone who didn't live at the home had left, one of the athletes who lived there locked the door to the house. But just because the house was now calm didn't mean the exterior of the house was settled. It was reported that when Crystal and Kim left the party, one of the women called the athletes short dick white boys. It was also reported that the two women were making fun of the athletes by saying the only way they could get some action was by paying for it. It was then alleged that one of the players referred to the women by the N-word. Crystal climbed into Kim's car, and as they drove away, she called emergency dispatch and reported that a white man had called her a racial slur, and she gave the address of the party. When the police arrived at the house, this was just after 1 a.m., the scene was pretty much silent. No one answered the door, and all the partygoers were gone. But it wasn't over for Kim and Crystal. As they were driving away, the two women began arguing. Kim stopped her car and tried to physically push Crystal out. Well, she wasn't successful, and she's in the middle of the road, so she continued a short distance further and pulled into a Kroger grocery store parking lot. Kim went inside the store and approached the female security guard, asking for help in getting Crystal out of her car. The guard approached the car and asked Crystal to comply with Kim's request and just get out of the vehicle. The guard would later report that she could smell alcohol in Crystal's breath, and she could see that Crystal was potentially under the influence of drugs. When Crystal wouldn't get out of the car, the guard called 911. Police arrived to the Kroger parking lot and the questioning began. And there was no success with that questioning. Crystal could barely talk, and when she did, her speech was slurred. She didn't have an ID. She couldn't really walk because she's inebriated. So with no other option, police took her to the Durham Center Access Facility. Okay, that's a mental health and substance abuse institution. It was then, during her intake process, that Crystal mentions for the first time that she was raped by some of the players. Now, the facility immediately transferred Crystal to Duke University Medical Center for a sexual assault exam. Her exam revealed pretty much nothing. She had no marks on her skin. She had no swelling, no abnormalities, and the final report listed 3 small cuts on her right knee and heel. She told the examiner that she had not sustained any physical blows to her body by the men's hands. So that was the exterior of her body. Her interior, well, there was something somewhat remarkable there. Her vagina was swollen, but she also told the examiner that she had performed for a couple shortly before she had gone to the lacrosse party, and during that performance, she had used a toy that might have caused the irritation. Okay, so we have an accusation of rape by Crystal, stemming from the broomstick comment. And now we have an examination. But what's happening with the players? Well, in an act of what I'm going to call incredible poor taste and just all around disgusting behavior, Ryan McFadden, he's a member of the lacrosse team. Well, he sent out an email to other players just a couple of hours after the party ended. And here's how that email started. To whom it may concern, tomorrow night After tonight's show, I've decided to have some strippers over to Eden's 2C. Okay, I think that's one of the lacrosse players' homes. All are welcome. However, there will be no nudity. I plan on killing the bitches as soon as they walk in and proceeding to cut their skin off while ejaculating in my Duke issue spandex. Okay. Then it goes on and says, all in besides Ark and Tack. Okay, so that's two of his teammates. So he's saying everybody's invited except those two, I guess. And then he says, please respond. All right, you guys, I kind of cleaned that up a bit, but I think you get what I mean by the disgusting script. But here's the deal with all of it. Apparently, several of the players had studied the novel American Psycho in their college courses. And part of that email script is a nod to that novel. Some of the players responded to the email with references to the novel. So it's what I would refer to as an inside joke with my friends, except I wouldn't make that kind of a joke. But that's the context we're looking at. Well, that email was the catalyst for the legal events that would follow. The house was searched by police, and the 3 team captains who lived there all gave DNA samples pretty quickly, almost immediately. They also offered to submit to lie detector tests. 2 days after the party and 1 day after the investigation began, the Durham Police Department went public by asking for help from anyone who was near the party scene. Crystal was re-interviewed by investigators more than once over the next 4 days. She was shown photo arrays of the Duke lacrosse players, which, by the way, is against department policy. She should have been shown players and then other filler photos, like other mug shots besides the players, but she was only shown the players. And during those photo arrays, Crystal identified Reed Seligman as a player, but not as one of her attackers. She was also shown a picture of David Evans. Okay, it's important to note he's a team captain and he's already submitted his DNA. She was shown his picture twice, and she never identified him as her attacker. So the public now has knowledge of this event, and the media, both locally and nationally, are clamoring for information. About a week and a half after the party, Durham County District Attorney Mike Nafong gets involved. He receives his first briefing from 2 detectives, and just a couple of hours later, he goes public with the case. But not just in one statement. He does over 50 interviews with reporters. In these interviews, he implies that the rape occurred, and he ignites the racial tensions of a Black woman allegedly being raped by entitled white men. Okay, this is so early on. These 50 interviews are happening within just hours and a couple of days after getting involved in the case. Now, during all of this, Crystal is again shown a photo array of 46 white lacrosse players. You guys, this house is small. 46 young men were not in attendance at this party. Yet all the players were shown to Crystal, and no filler photos were included. And it gets worse. The photos weren't on a page together. The photos were one by one, kind of like a computer display, like they would click, show her the next one, click, show her the next one. There was no comparing of the pictures. Again, against department policy, it was during this individual photo array that Crystal finally names her 3 attackers. And who does she name? David Evans, the guy who's already given his DNA, right off the bat. Reed Seligman, who said he left the party, and Colin Finnerty. She also was identifying players who were at the party, and she named at least one player who was not even there. See, it's important that she tell them who's at the party so they can be interviewed, but she includes a person wasn't even at the party. Well, Reed and Colin, they're arrested and indicted pretty quickly. This was about 3 weeks after the party. And Reed, well, he's pretty confident despite the arrest. He's telling everybody he's willing to be investigated because he has ATM records, he's got cell phone records, he's got photos of himself and a written statement by a taxi driver that will prove he wasn't even there during the time that Crystal said she was raped. Because remember, Reed and Colin left the party early when it started to kind of get out of hand. Well, with the massive national uproar, and with DA Nifong fueling the outrage, all of the players, except for the one Black player, they have their DNA collected. And then that DNA is compared to DNA found under some false fingernails that Crystal had ripped off of her hands and thrown in the trash while she was locked in the bathroom at the party. The state crime lab could not connect any of the DNA samples to those gathered from the fingernails. So on the first test, nothing is connected. When DA Nafong had an independent lab review the samples in a second test, David Evans was included with 2% of the population of all men who could not be excluded. Okay, here's the problem. The DA asked that not all the evidence be included in the report. So the DA, by omission, made David look more guilty than he potentially could have appeared. Now, due to all of that, David Evans was indicted 2 months after the party, and DA Nafong now has his 3 rapists in order to match up with Crystal's account of that night and her choosing of the 3 men from the mishandled photo lineup. All 3 boys were declaring their innocence. Now, you might be asking, where is Kim in all of this? You know, Crystal's co-worker? Shouldn't she be Crystal's best witness about what was going on? Well, Kim called the whole thing a, quote, crock. And she said she was with Crystal all but about 5 minutes of the night and that the rape didn't happen. Okay, remember that part where Crystal went outside for just a couple of minutes? I think that's probably the 5 minutes where they weren't together. Now, I'm old enough that I can remember all of this, you guys. These young men were guilty from minute 1 if you listen to most of the mainstream media. And a 3-minute news piece couldn't even come close to explaining the complexities of the case. Yet the whole nation thought these privileged white boys had done this. We've been talking for over 15 minutes in this podcast, and I've barely touched on all of the evidence that pointed away from these 3 young men. And the story didn't die down back then either. It seemed like it was night after night there was another update about how privileged these athletes were. Well, by December of that year, remember this happened in March. By December of that year, the reputations of these boys were destroyed, futures were permanently altered, and the athletic program, the lacrosse program, was kind of in shambles. They were doing a rebuild. Then DA Nafong dropped the rape charges against the 3 young men. The other charges were still pending, but Crystal's story had shifted again, and the DNA evidence was not going to back the rape charges. 6 days after the rape charges were dropped, the North Carolina bar filed an ethics charge against DA Nafong, accusing him of using the media to make racially prejudicial statements to the public and engaging in dishonesty, fraud, deceit, and misrepresentation. In the report, more than 100 examples were given of his unprofessional behavior. 2 weeks after that report was filed, Nafong asked to be removed from the case. Now, at this point, the whole department was taken off the case, and the state attorney general's office took over. And just 1 year after the party, all charges were dropped against the 3 lacrosse players. The attorney general described Nafong publicly as, quote, a rogue prosecutor. During the initial months of the investigation, the media frenzy and the racial tension took up all the oxygen, which left the gaping holes in the case unreported. There were things like Crystal's changing story. She at first said it was 20 men who raped her. Then it was just 3. She also, in some reports, said she was groped and not even raped. When the DNA evidence didn't fit, she changed her story to say that she was penetrated from behind, most likely with the broom handle. But that wasn't part of the initial claim. And her time frame varied drastically. She said she was raped at 11:35. Yet she took a phone call right around 11:35 that lasted for 3 minutes. And Reed had evidence that he wasn't even there during that timestamp. And it's 2006, so when Crystal changed the time of the rape again, players had photos of her with timestamps showing she wasn't being raped. Crystal also said David had a mustache. Well, David didn't have a mustache that night. Photo evidence proved he didn't. All in all, Crystal formally changed the events of the night with investigators 5 times. And then there's the behavior of the Durham police. They went after the taxi driver who provided an alibi for Reed. They revisited an old charge on that taxi driver of shoplifting, and they reinstated that charge, trying to bully him into changing his statement. They also arrested Crystal's former husband and her friend on other charges, most likely because they were giving statements saying Crystal couldn't be believed. And it wasn't the first time that the detectives on the case had tussled with Duke athletes. Investigations into those detectives showed repeated instances where athletes were charged with kind of ticky-tacky misdemeanors that would have been completely overlooked if the suspect was just your average community member. And because I know you are wondering, and I was wondering, in 2006, was D.A. Nafong up for re-election? The answer is yes. And he was facing strong opposition in the primary. People believe that he needed this high-profile case to project to the community that he was tackling racial and economic injustices. Now, of course, racial and economic injustices exist. It doesn't mean you lie about a case to make yourself look good for re-election. Well, ultimately, Nafong was disbarred and found criminally liable for making false statements. He served 1 day in jail. And like I said, that party and that year fundamentally changed David, Reed's, and Colin's life, as well as permanently altering Crystal's life. Colin, after being indicted, was also recharged with an assault charge that happened clear a year before the party in D.C. He had apparently gotten into a scuffle with a man outside of a bar, and initially charges were filed, but they were dropped due to lack of evidence. Well, after the media frenzy about the party and the rape charges, those charges in D.C. were brought again, and Colin faced severe restrictions by a judge in D.C. Well, in December, when Colin was cleared of the rape charges, magically, the D.C. case was dropped also. And the university and its students, well, they received multiple threats during the investigation. More than 100 threats were leveled against Ryan McFadden. Okay, remember, he's the athlete who wrote the poor taste email that mirrored the novel. And Crystal, well, she was outed pretty quickly as the accuser, even though her identity should have been kept secret. And it wasn't just by one media outlet. More than a dozen prominent outlets openly published her identity. And the three young men, Colin, Reed, and David, well, Duke University ultimately paid each one of them $20 million. At least that's what Duke said. However, Reed's attorney is on record stating that Duke University actually overevaluated what they paid to the three young men and that the three didn't receive but a fraction of that amount of money. You know what? Who knows? I don't know. The men were wrongly accused, so they deserve something. And with the terms of the lawsuit, it's not supposed to be disclosed how much they received. Well, what happened to these boys? Reed went on to play for Brown University, and he has worked with the Innocence Project in a fundraising capacity. He is now a lawyer. Well, Colin, he went on to play lacrosse at another college. And David received his MBA from Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. And those members of the team that were not accused? Well, those who stayed at the university had tough college years, especially that year right following the party. Some of the players made claims that professors were failing them purposely just because they belonged to the team. The NCAA did grant an additional year of eligibility to 33 players on the team during that 2006 season. And in 2010, some of those players, the freshman players, well, they helped the lacrosse team win a national championship. And that house, the one where the party occurred, and the one that was owned by the university, well, it's been demolished. Well, I gave you all that backstory. We've got an update, right? Here's the update to this story. It's all about Crystal in this update. She granted an interview from prison to an online show called Let's Talk with Kat. So first off, why is she in prison? Well, she stabbed her boyfriend in 2011. He died from his wounds days later. Crystal said she stabbed him in self-defense because he was assaulting her. She ultimately was convicted of second-degree murder, and she's serving at least 14 years for the crime. In her interview, which was broadcast last week, Crystal said the following about the three athletes. I testified falsely against them by saying that they raped me when they didn't, and that was wrong. And I betrayed the trust of a lot of other people who believed in me. I made up a story that wasn't true because I wanted validation from people and not from God. She then asked for forgiveness from the three men, stating that she loves them and that they didn't deserve what they got. She explained to Kat that the three men had taken her into their home on the night of the party and that she shouldn't have done harm to them because they trusted her to do no harm to them. She called the three men her brothers and explained that she had betrayed their trust. Well, Kat, the interviewer, said she felt it was important to understand why some in North Carolina view Crystal as a pariah. I mean, this woman is hated by some people. And then others in North Carolina view her as a victim. I think it's important to pay attention to something here. It isn't the first opportunity that Crystal had to clear her conscience or to ask for forgiveness. She's given other interviews prior to her incarceration for the murder of her boyfriend. And in those interviews, she doubled down on wanting justice for herself. Crystal even wrote a book titled The Dance of Grace in 2008, where she encouraged young women to not be afraid to speak out when they are sexually assaulted or abused. But the statute of limitations has run its course for Crystal. She cannot be charged with a crime for now admitting that she fabricated the story, which might be why she gave the interview to Kat. And I also want to point out something else here. If you want a way more in-depth telling of this story, because I gave you guys just brief details of what happened, you can go to the 2016 documentary Fantastic Lies. That was produced by ESPN as part of their 30 for 30 series. I don't know how much more healing can happen for this community. I do kind of feel bad that all of this has resurfaced because I bet it has opened up some wounds that were maybe a little bit more settled or healed. Now, you guys, when I bring you a murder case, most of the time, a dead body is found either by a stranger or by family and friends. Maybe it happens after a welfare check. Or sometimes when I bring you a story, violence has occurred and that violence ends in death and there are witnesses who report the murder. And sometimes the murderer tries to hide the body and the clues lead investigators back to the murder. But in upstate New York last week, the body of a murdered man was driven to the Livingston County Sheriff's Office, and the man delivering the body has been arrested for murder. And there's one more unusual fact in this story. Tagging along for the reporting of the dead body was the man's defense attorney. Okay, back on December 10th, Livingston County Sheriff's Office received a 911 call being placed from someone in a car in the Sheriff's Office parking lot. Defense attorney Brian DiCarlo, and I hope I'm saying his name right, was telling dispatch that his client wanted to, quote, turn in a dead body. The client was Richard Flugel Jr., and he was parked in the lot with his dead father's body, Richard Flugel Sr., in the car. So from here on out, I'm going to call them Junior and Senior just for ease in telling you the details. Now, it's important to note that the attorney, well, he had just begun representing Richard Jr. hours before. And he was pretty much as shocked initially like the sheriff's office was when the 911 call was made. It seems the murder scenario started to unfold just 2 days prior. 60-year-old Richard Sr. didn't return home on December 8th, and he then didn't show the next morning for his flight out of New York. Later that morning, Richard Sr.'s car was found in a parking lot, and that led the sheriff's office to begin investigating his whereabouts. But a good share of the work was done for them when 30-year-old Richard Jr. showed up in the parking lot with his father dead from a gunshot wound in his car. When the police secured a search warrant for Richard Jr.'s property, they said they found evidence that leads them to believe that Richard Jr. shot Richard Sr. on the property twice with a shotgun. They also say that Richard Jr. tried to conceal his father's body before changing his mind and driving the body to the sheriff's office. And there's a side note here. Police also searched Richard Jr.'s home for evidence of a marijuana grow operation. Apparently, they already thought that criminal operation was occurring before they went to the house to look for evidence in the murder. Now, Richard Jr. was booked into the county jail and is being held without bond due to his prior criminal history and also current suspected connections to nefarious activity. He's been charged with murder and tampering with evidence. He is being arraigned today. A friend of Richard's Sr. told WHAM 13, makes me wonder if they go by WHAM, but WHAM 13, that Richard Sr. has 2 children and that he spent his free time riding motorcycles. that friend said that Richard Sr. was the kind of guy that just didn't have anyone saying anything bad about him. He also referred to him as one hell of a friend. Okay, clearly there is more to this story here. We don't have a motive. We don't know if others were involved. And of course, Richard is innocent until proven guilty. So just because the sheriff's department says that's how it happened, doesn't mean that's how it happened. I'll watch this case for updates and let you know when I know. And finally today, I just want to preface this with, I know I just brought you a polygamy case, but this is a completely different cult that is at the center of the murder of the 13-month-old who died. Here's what happened 4 years ago. In December of 2020, 20-year-old Chloe Driver and her husband Benjamin, or Ben Michael, or Brian, or Z, yeah, he goes by all of those names in this cult, but I'm going to call him Ben. So Ben and Chloe and their 13-month-old daughter were traveling from North Carolina to Florida. During that drive, they made a stop in Canton, Georgia, which isn't part of the direct route. So they went out of their way to stop there. And whatever sort of mental illness went down in that home, 2 hours after they arrived, Chloe took a knife from the kitchen, locked herself in the bathroom with her baby, and stabbed her baby daughter 4 times in the back and once in the neck, and then stabbed herself. When police arrived at the scene and started figuring out who everyone was and who did what, they discovered that Ben had 2 other wives and that Chloe had soured on the polygamist relationship. Well, Chloe pled mental illness in the 6-day trial, but the jury rejected that plea and found her guilty of malice murder, felony murder, cruelty to children in the 1st degree, and aggravated assault. Basically, they found her guilty of everything. Ben said he was not the problem. He labeled Chloe as manipulative and said his daughter was a healthy, happy child. I'm going to add my own opinion here. There's nothing healthy or happy about bringing a child into a polygamist relationship. So Chloe, she was sentenced on Friday. And before sentencing, she read a statement expressing grief and remorse. She also said she sees her daughter in her own tears and she accepts any punishment given to her. The judge sentenced her to 20 years in prison and referenced the profound impact this case had on the responding officers. Those officers were highly affected by the brutality shown to the infant. The judge did recognize that Chloe had tried to commit suicide since the murder due to her extreme mental fragility, and she acknowledged that she is mentally compromised. The Georgia Department of Corrections will now build a plan to aid her in her mental health treatment while incarcerated. The judge also has begun the process of providing mental health treatment for the jurors due to the graphic and traumatic evidence that was shared at trial. 135 pieces of evidence was presented, and that included the emotional 911 call, the crime scene photos, and also the murder weapon. Assistant DA Katie Groper probably said it best when she told the jury, "No matter how hopeless you feel, no matter how desperate you feel, no matter how angry you feel, no matter how frustrated you feel, you don't get to commit the act of murder because it's the law." Well, now to our YouTube and other comments. Kelly D on YouTube referenced the concept of our case that we covered on Thursday about Gary Ferris. Well, she referenced the part where Gary didn't even get a funeral since his family was feuding so much following the murder. Kelly said that you often wonder who will attend your funeral, but you never really wonder if you'll get a funeral at all. I think Kelly was correct when she said that one fact alone, that he didn't get a funeral, well, it displayed how dysfunctional the family was. And Andrea on YouTube said she couldn't decide who actually committed the murder. She feels like Scott, the son, could have murdered his dad, and also Melody could have been a murderer. And I had other people mention to me, maybe it was the two of them combined. Who knows? The jury found Melody guilty, so she is the one currently being held to justice for Gary's murder. And then someone who goes by the name Autistic Chickens on YouTube, well, they left a comment saying that my family is pretty cool. You guys, I agree. I love my family. And we're so happy we can share our family in this media realm. All right, that's your Monday episode of Rise in Crime. Thanks for joining me here. I always say it, you guys. I know I always say it. You guys are the best. Thank you for being my listeners and doing this journey with me. The 5-star reviews keep pouring in. I love that. I would love more. If you haven't left one yet, please do. And the positive comments on the post just help everything grow. You could also like and follow us on our social media accounts and our YouTube accounts at Oh No Media. A reminder, it's Into the Dark, Murder with My Husband, and Rise in Crime. Those are my cool family members that we talked about in the listener comments. And please share this podcast with a friend. That's always helpful. You can join me again on Thursday for more morning crime news. I'm Mama Jules, and keep safe out there.